YouTube here with a post-fight video of the Jaron Ennis versus David Avanesyan fight. Now, before I give you the summary of what happened in the fight, I'm going to tell you the results first. Jaron Ennis was successful in defending his IBF welterweight title. He won this fight via 6th round TKO corner stoppage. Before the 6th round began, Avanesyan did not make it out of his corner, hence what caused the stoppage to the fight. And Jaron Ennis, this was a one-sided performance. This was a dominant clinic that he put on. I had it 5 rounds to nothing for Jaron Ennis before the stoppage happened. And I got to give credit where it's due because Avanesyan did do a efficient job at hanging in there with Jaron Ennis going blow for blow. It might have not been as effective as Ennis's work, but Avanesyan stood in there toe-to-toe with Ennis, and he was landing some heavy blows as well. And as far as how the fight went, Jaron Ennis, it didn't take much for him to open up. From the sound of the bell, he was going to work, and Jaron Ennis displayed his great abilities, and Ennis is what you would call a natural hybrid. The guy, he's got all the tools to make him a top tier level talent. And Ennis, he could fight from any range. He showed in this fight that he can work off of volume, and his work rate is efficient as ever, and his work rate being at such a high output like he displayed in this fight goes to show his durability as far as his stamina goes and how consistent he can be with his offense, because he was very heavily offensively minded in this fight, and as well as him being a good defensive fighter as well, he showed good defense in this fight as well, because while he was on the inside going blow for blow with Avanesyan, he did a good job at avoiding shots from Avanesyan with his great athleticism and his good reflexes, and his movement is what helps him avoid those shots when exchanging on the inside. And Jaron Ennis, he can fight on the outside and on the inside. He's got one of the best jabs in the game today, and he does a good job at establishing that jab to set the range for the fight. And if necessary, Ennis use that jab to remain on the outside. But in this fight, it was more like a setup punch and a offensive key starter for Jaron Ennis, and it was for him to get in the range and set the tune for his offense and set up his combos. And Jaron Ennis, he put on a heck of a performance versus Avanesyan, and Avanesyan, he was very brave, brazen. He wasn't gun-shy, to so to say. And Avanesyan recovered from a low blow in the first round. As I had said, Ennis, from the sound of the bell, he went straight to work, and he was bringing it to Avanesyan, and Avanesyan is known to be a slow starter, and it was overwhelming for him with the offensive output that Ennis was bringing to him from the sound of the bell. And Avanesyan got hit with a low blow when he held Jaron Ennis's head down, and Ennis went to hit him with a right hook to the body, and because his head was being held, he didn't place his punch that he meant to place towards the midsection of Avanesyan. Instead, it hit him below the belt, and that seemed to take a toll on Avanesyan. He didn't take the full 5 minutes to recover, but it did take him a while to recover from that devastating shot. And Jaron Ennis, he's made a reputation out of him being able to mix up his punches and being very accurate with his punch placement and very smart how he places his punches and how well he times it. And he displayed that in this fight as well, going to the head and as well as to the body, hitting whatever target was available to him. And Jaron Ennis is a killer finisher, and it's due to these attributes that got him the reputation of being a killer finisher. And he did that in this fight. He was able to drop Avanesyan in the 5th round with a right hand. And Avanesyan, as I had said, once Jaron Ennis really got into the groove of his game plan and his onslaught, it was all Ennis and Avanesyan. The work rate that Ennis was bringing towards him seemed to be too much. Even though Avanesyan was banging it out with him, Avanesyan, he wasn't doing the more efficient, effective work as it was showing as the fight was approaching towards his latter end. Hence why Avanesyan couldn't make it out of his corner to begin the 6th round. And Ennis, he's also earned himself a reputation of being a natural switch stance hitter. He's comfortable from fighting in both stance, both orthodox and southpaw, and he's got power in both hands, and he's good on either stance. And that's what makes Ennis such a hybrid fighter that all boxing fans look towards as far as the technical aspects go, because this guy got all the attributes to make him a elite and perhaps a historical pound for pound great, depending on how successful his career goes. And he's already a IBF welterweight champion at such a young age, so he has already surpassed that prospect stage because of the fact that he has a belt under his name, regardless of the fact that he didn't get to win that IBF welterweight title versus the legitimate champion, who was Terrence Crawford, after he defeated Errol Spence in that dominant performance during their undisputed welterweight title bout last year. And Ennis, he is still somewhat green in his pro boxing career. He had an extensive amateur career as well, and before he was officially made to be the IBF welterweight champion, he was the interim IBF welterweight champion, and he was collecting impressive wins with dominant clinical performances, such as he put on in this fight versus Avanesyan. And Ennis, because of his style and his highly technical skills, has got him to get to that championship status level. And if you look at his resume, he defeated guys like Karan Chukagian, Thomas Dullamore, Sergey Lipinets, and Royman Villa, just to name a few. And him defeating David Avanesyan, who was a replacement opponent last minute after Cody Crowley, who was the original opponent that was scheduled for this fight versus Jaron Ennis, who is the #1 ranked welterweight according to the IBF, and that belt, which is held by Jaron Ennis. And Crowley had to pull out of this fight due to, I believe, a injury. Correct me if I'm wrong. But as far as Jaron Ennis' next opponent goes, it's most likely going to be versus Cody Crowley because of the IBF ranking and because that was the original scheduled bout for Jaron Ennis to step in there versus Cody Crowley instead of David Avanesyan. And Jaron Ennis, as I have said, those names that he defeated aren't the most notable names when it comes to the welterweight division, and that was when he was fighting with the PBC promotion, and Jaron Ennis signed a new deal with Matchroom and the Zone, and this was his first fight with Matchroom and the Zone, and it was his welcome home fight in Philadelphia, and Ennis hasn't fought in his hometown of Philadelphia in over 6 years. And Ennis, he hasn't main evented a big event. He has main evented cards before, but it wasn't of a Errol Spence or Terrence Crawford magnitude. And Jaron Ennis isn't on that level yet when it comes to his drawing ability, but if he collects wins like he did versus David Avanesyan and continues his impressive uppity undefeated win streak, it's inevitable that he's gonna get there one day, and he's got to keep up this high level performance, and he's got to be able to maintain it. And Jaron Ennis right now, when it comes to the welterweight division, unfortunately for him, it isn't as marketable as it once was when Terrence Crawford and Errol Spence was both competing at that weight class. And as we know, Terrence Crawford and both Errol Spence, after their fight, they both have officially moved up to super welterweight. As we know, Terrence Crawford had a fight versus Israel Madrimov yesterday for the WBA super welterweight title in what was Terrence Crawford's debut fight at 154, and he doesn't compete at 147 anymore. And the IBF welterweight title, as I mentioned before, was a title which was once held by Terrence Crawford before he vacated that title to move up to super welterweight, and that's what gave the room of opportunity for Jaron Ennis to scoop the vacated IBF welterweight title instead of him defeating Terrence Crawford to win that belt. Not to discredit the championship that is currently held by Jaron Ennis, but it would have been much more impressive if Ennis were to get that off of Terrence Crawford to become the IBF welterweight champion. And Terrence Crawford has been a household name in the sport of boxing for almost a decade now, and Jaron Ennis is just now recently coming up on to the top of the scene, and he is regarded as the best welterweight in the welterweight division right now. And there is no current unified welterweight champion unless you count Terrence Crawford as a active champion at welterweight, because the WBA and the WBO welterweight title is still held by Terrence Crawford last time that I had checked. And as we know, the regular WBA welterweight title is currently held by undefeated Iamanis Stanionis, who in his last fight was successful in defending his WBA regular welterweight title in May via decision. And the WBC welterweight title is held by Mario Barrios, who defeated Yordanis Ugas and Fabian Maidana in Santiago. That establishes Mario Barrios' 3-fight win streak that he got currently going on right now. And in his last fight, which was also in May, he defeated Fabian Maidana via unanimous decision to become the WBC welterweight champion. And Mario Barrios, having bouts with notable names like Keith Thurman and Gervonta Davis and Yordanis Ugas, that helps Mario Barrios' case of him being a well-recognized name amongst the top of the welterweights, and him also being a current champion helps that case of him being one of the elites in the welterweight division right now. And Yordanis Ugas, as you know, he got in there with the likes of Errol Spence, Sean Porter, and Manny Pacquiao. And that makes Yordanis Ugas, and him also being a former champion as well, be a well-recognized name amongst the welterweight division. And Mario Barrios, after he lost to Keith Thurman and Gervonta Davis, he defeated Yordanis Ugas, Fabian Maidana, and Santiago. And those 3 wins were convincing wins that Mario Barrios pulled against those 3 guys. And those names aren't bad names to have on your resume as victories to cement your legitimacy. And I'm speaking for Mario Barrios and his legitimacy. And if Mario Barrios was to collide versus Jaron Ennis would be the favorite to walk away with the W in that fight. And would that fight be easy to make? I don't know. The only reason why Mario Barrios was featured on a DAZN card is because there was a cross-promotional bout that happened this past May with when Canelo Alvarez fought Jamie Munguia, because Canelo Alvarez had a deal with PBC, and he made a decision to have a cross-promotional bout with a Golden Boy promotion promoted fighter who has his fights aired on DAZN, and Jamie Munguia, which didn't make a lot of sense because Canelo Alvarez has beef with Golden Boy, and it didn't make sense as to why Canelo Alvarez didn't choose to make a all in-house PBC fight, which would have made things a lot easier when it comes to the promotional side of things, with him fighting one of his mandatory challengers in David Benavidez, which is a fight that I can confidently say all boxing fans and sports fans and the public wants to see. And instead, we got Jamie Munguia, who is almost as credible as a David Benavidez, but not as deserving as Benavidez, getting a shot at Canelo Alvarez for his undisputed super middleweight titles. And I am bringing this topic up because Mario Barrios, being a champion that is marketable amongst the top of the welterweights, and Jaron Ennis, him signing this new deal with Matchroom and DAZN, makes that fight more unlikely to happen, because that bout right there, even though they are well-recognized faces amongst boxing fans, but when it comes to the public, those fans that don't tap into boxing as often as avid boxing fans, that fight isn't a big enough of a fight to where 2 different promotions come together to make that bout happen. And Jaron Ennis, it would have been easier if he was to re-sign with PBC to make that fight happen versus Mario Barrios for a shot at unifying both the WBC and IBF welterweight titles. And as I mentioned before, the WBO and WBA titles are still currently held by Terrence Crawford, last time that I had checked. And the interim WBO welterweight title is held by undefeated prospect Brian Norman Jr., and he is promoted by Top Rank and has his fights aired on ESPN. And I wouldn't be surprised if the WBA makes Terrence Crawford vacate, and as well as the WBO joining the WBA in making Terrence Crawford vacate his welterweight titles and crowning their respective interim title lists as the official welterweight champion. and that will go to Brian Norman Jr. for the WBO and Stanionis for the WBA, and that would make each individual title organizations have their own welterweight champions. And because of the promotional side of things, it would be difficult to make a fight happen for unifying the welterweight titles other than Stanionis and Mario Barrios, who both are promoted by PBC. And as far as Conor Benn goes, who is a well marketable and recognizable name amongst the top of the welterweights, he is ranked quite high by the IBF. Last time I checked, he was number 2 or 3, and he made his recent comeback earlier this year after his suspension, and he defeated Peter Dobson via decision after a year-long layoff. It wasn't his best performance. We've seen better from Conor Benn before, but give him, as long as he's been inactive, you expect ring rust from fighters that green. And Peter Dobson is still, not Peter Dobson, pardon me, Conor Benn is still a prospect with a lot of potential. And if he makes improvement in his game and adds to his arsenals, he's still got a promising future. And he is promoted by Matchroom as well and has his fights broadcasted on the Zone, like Jaron Ennis, who made his DAZN debut after signing a new deal with Matchroom. That fight could be a all Matchroom DAZN promoted fight. That could be a cross-seas big welterweight bout with two fighters with promising futures ahead of them, and them being a prospect that are well recognized amongst boxing fans. It would be a big fight with two fighters in the tip-top shape of their career, and both are still young and fresh. And I say Conor Benn would need 2 or 3 more fights to warm up to get a title shot versus a fighter like Jaron Ennis, because they both came up together relatively at the same time. It's that Jaron Ennis has done a better job at staying more consistent and staying more active and not having any controversies following him, unlike Conor Benn. And Jaron Ennis doesn't come from a generational boxing family. Not to discredit Conor Benn and his ability, but Jaron Ennis had to build his career with his own reputation without any expectations from a family name, unlike Conor Benn. And Ennis, I would also say, is fundamentally more sound than Conor Benn and has put in more work. Hence why I say Conor Benn has to put in more work for him to earn himself a possible title shot in the future versus Jaron Ennis, because Jaron Ennis, when it comes to his abilities in the ring, it's top notch. I would say it's there almost on the same level as a Terrence Crawford. And if I'm bold enough to say it, I can say that Jaron Ennis, par for par, skill for skill, is up there technically with a Terrence Crawford. It's that Terrence Crawford has more maturity with more experience that he has over on a much younger Jaron Ennis. But Jaron Ennis, with the attributes and skills that he's displayed so far throughout his ongoing successful career, reminds me a lot of Terrence Crawford and his up-and-coming days. And there's a lot of similarities there as well stylistically, because Terrence Crawford, much like Jaron Ennis, is a natural switch stance hitter and can fight from any position, and their athleticism helps them fight from either southpaw or orthodox and fight comfortably and still be able to display good ring generalship skills, and as well as being comfortable and creating angles and controlling the distance and range and fight at a subpar level from either stance and have the speed that they normally fight at not be affected despite them switching stance from whether southpaw to orthodox or from orthodox to southpaw. And that skill right there is rare, that not a lot of fighters tend to have. And Jaron Ennis is one of those special talents that has that ability and displays a more than subpar performance every time and shows improvement fight by fight. And in this fight, he showed his durability, his ability to take to give, and his ability to stay calm when his opponents are engaging with him on the inside, which where a lot of slick fighters like Jaron Ennis tends to not have this ability to lock in with their opponents on the inside. For slick defensive fighters that are athletic and that rely a lot on their reflexes like a Jaron Ennis tend to be uncomfortable to go blow for blow close range with their opponents. And Jaron Ennis in this fight was able to get in there close range with his opponents, go blow for blow, and get the better in the exchange and display great attributes and good technical skills as him being accurate, still maintaining his energy and being reserved and calm, picking his shots wisely, timing his opponent, and placing his combos beautifully and accurately, staying focused while in the midst of a fiery exchange, and staying calm when getting hit with shots as well, and being focused enough to be able to counter efficiently and effectively. And that is what you look for in a complete boxer in boxing. And Jaron Ennis has a lot of promises when it comes to his stability as a legitimate welterweight champion. He's got a lot of potential. And as we know, him and Vergil Ortiz, when Vergil Ortiz was still competing at welterweight, because Vergil Ortiz in his last fight moved up to super welterweight, other than Arthur Beterbiev, Vergil Ortiz is the only notable fighter that is currently at the top of his game that has a 100% knockout ratio, is undefeated, and has all his wins via knockout or via TKO. And Vergil Ortiz is a very active fighter, a dangerous fighter with fierce power and speed, and he's got that fan-friendly style that attracts a lot of fans and attention to his name because of his ability to provide. And Vergil Ortiz isn't as technically sound as a Jaron Ennis, but has that reputation that he's earned with the victories that he's been earning in the way how he's been earning them. And one point at a time, when Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford, before they met in the ring, Jaron Ennis and Vergil Ortiz was talked about to take their place as the number 1 and 2 welterweights in the welterweight division. And currently right now, all three other than Jaron Ennis has moved up to super welterweight. Now, if Vergil Ortiz was to come back down to 147, that would be a all the zone network of a fight with Jaron Ennis being with Matchroom now and having his fights aired on the Zone, and Virgil Ortiz being promoted by Golden Boy, and Virgil Ortiz has been a household name on the Zone, and that fight would be a huge fight because of where both Ortiz and Ennis is at in their current ongoing careers right now. They're not on the level as far as marketability goes as where Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford was. And that's because Errol Spence and Terrence Crawford has been fighting for longer than both Ennis and Ortiz has. They got to get a few more bouts under their belt and continue their impressive performances to keep this uppity slope going, to make their names more known amongst the public and gain more fans by putting on performances like we saw Ennis put on versus Avanesyan and Ortiz in his last fight. And as we know, Ennis is the only guy out of those names that I had mentioned that still competes at welterweight. It was rumored that Virgil Ortiz was supposed to take on Tim Tszyu on the undercard to the Crawford versus Madrimov fight, and Tim Tszyu had to pull out of that fight due to an injury that he suffered during his training camp. And as we know, Tim Tszyu in his last fight, he had a bloody brawl, a very gutsy brawl that he had versus Sebastian Fundora, where Fundora came out on top and became the new unified WBO and WBC super welterweight champion, and former unified welterweight champion Errol Spence is scheduled to take on Sebastian Fundora and challenge Fundora for his newly won WBC and WBO super welterweight title in his debut fight at 154 later this year. Scheduled for the fall of this year is Fundora versus Spence, and is scheduled to be at the Cowboy Stadium in Dallas, which is where Errol Spence is built to be from. And as we know, it was rumored that Ennis, who was a longtime mandatory challenger to take on Errol Spence when Errol Spence was the IBF welterweight champion, that fight, all those fights seem to be out of question for Jaron Ennis because all those guys have decided to move up to super welterweight, and Ennis looks comfortable at being the man at welterweight. And if he continues to stack victories like the one he did versus Avanesyan, it's inevitable that Ennis is going to become the man at welterweight, and he is already recognized by most critics and fans and boxing outlets as the number one pound for pound welterweight in the welterweight division right now. And as I have said, it's most likely that when Crowley recovers, Ennis for his next fight is gonna fight Cody Crowley, who is the number one ranked contender according to the IBF for Ennis's next fight. And surprisingly, despite the fact that the original opponent that was scheduled to face Ennis had to pull out of that fight, there was a good amount of a turnout of a event that we saw for Ennis in his home crowd in Philadelphia when he took on Avanesyan, because it didn't look like an empty arena, and it wasn't like Ennis was fighting at a bingo hall or a warehouse. He fought at the same arena where the Sixers and the Flyers play, and there seemed to be enough people in attendance for Ennis's fight. And that can be due to the fact that Ennis being from Philly and this fight being hosted in Philly is the reason to why there was a successful crowd in attendance. But if Ennis was to have his next fight in Philadelphia as well, with the performance that he put on in his home crowd, it's more likely that he's going to have more support regardless of who his next opponent is going to be for his next fight. And as I had said, this was yet another impressive performance on the part of Ennis. Things are only looking up for this man right now. And that does it for this post-fight video. Subscribe to this channel for more content. And if y'all like this video, y'all can hit the like button and share this video if y'all want. Click the links in the description to show y'all support for this channel. Anything will be appreciated. And that does it for this post-fight video, y'all. As I said, I'm out. Be good and peace.